Thank you. Resuming debate on the throne speech. Recognize the leader of the third party.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, I am pleased to rise today to provide a response to the speech from the throne on behalf of the third party in this House. I want to begin by acknowledging that we meet on the unceded territory of the Wolastoq Whig people and that our relationship is governed by treaties of peace and friendship, as it is with the Passamaquoddy and Mi'kmaq people. I also want to acknowledge that we have not been respecting those treaties, which has led to injustice and discord. It is time that agreements are struck to settle the Crown Lands question so that First Nations have the land base and resources they need to sustain their future. Then we can get on with meeting the challenges that face all of us together. It is a privilege to serve the people of Fredericton South in our provincial parliament and to sit as the leader of the Green Party. It is our duty to use this privileged position to represent our constituents, no matter how they voted, no matter whether they are citizens or newcomers, no matter whether they are old enough to vote or not. As parliamentarians, we also have an obligation to do our best to pursue the common good and represent the future interests of our children, of youth, and of those yet to be born. To be sure, that means thinking long-term, for the long haul. In a time of rapid deterioration in our climate and in the face of ecological decline in our forests, rivers, and ocean waters, and in the face of extinction of species, we have a particular responsibility to reroute our path to the future, away from satiating greed to nourishing need. We have our challenges in New Brunswick. We can, however, resolve them as long as political considerations don't take precedence over the public interest. There is nothing wrong with New Brunswick, Mr. Speaker, that cannot be fixed by what is right about New Brunswick. Our biggest barriers to change, in fact, are political, Mr. Speaker, not economic. It's a question, in fact, of having the will and the wisdom to act for the common good. Mais agir résolument exige que nous croyions fermement dans notre capacité de créer le type de Nouveau-Brunswick que nous voulons pour nos enfants et nos petits-enfants. Mais qu'est-ce que cela signifie au juste? Alors que nous soulignons le 50e anniversaire du Canada, c'était il y a 150 ans que trois solitudes ont émergé au Nouveau-Brunswick. Les Premières Nations, les Acadiens et les anglophones. Les défis auxquels nous sommes confrontés demandent une action collective. Mais pour aller au-delà de ces solitudes, il faut une compréhension mutuelle et une réconciliation basée sur la réussite de la vérité concernant notre passé et l'établissement de justes relations entre nous. This Legislative Assembly has a role to play in achieving these things, Mr. Speaker, but it has become ill-equipped. The executive branch of government, as it has ping-ponged back and forth between Liberals and Tories, has over the years engineered what amounts to a silent coup, usurping the powers of this Parliament to exercise control over its activities. As lawmakers, overseers of public finances, and representatives of our constituents, we are functioning in an institutional culture now where it is no longer clear to many who watch us what, in fact, our job involves. I have heard some say they don't think it serves the public any good to hear what individual MLAs agree with or don't agree with. That once bills have been introduced for first reading in this Legislative Assembly, they actually are good to go. Before they've been debated, before they've been examined clause by clause at committee, before they've had a chance to have amendments considered, and before the public has had a chance to comment. Some even say that debates about proposed legislation are best kept behind closed caucus doors, Mr. Speaker. It leaves me wondering, what is our purpose here? Today I tabled a debatable motion asking the members of the legislature to give the authority to our standing committees to call for persons, papers, and documents. I hear members frequently referring to the legislature as the People's House, but our standing committee do not currently have the authority to invite the people before them. Pourtant, nous excluons des New Brunswickois de participer dans les travaux de cette institution démocratique. Nous restreignons leur rôle à celui de spectateurs dans la tribune du public. Nos comités permanents devraient pouvoir convoquer des témoins de la population pour nous assister dans nos travaux avec les témoignages qu'ils peuvent présenter, comme cela se fait déjà dans la plupart des parlements au Canada. The other motion I tabled this morning would require that the Standing Committee on Procedures, Privileges and Legislative Officers call the legislative officers, except the Auditor General, to present their reports and recommendations to them so that this committee can follow up on those recommendations. At the moment, Mr. Speaker, the reports and recommendations from the legislative officers simply land on a virtual shelf and for the most part collect cyber dust. This is no way for us to treat the work of our legislative officers. Increasingly, the work of the government, Mr. Speaker, is being obscured from this legislative assembly. A large amount of activity of government is now occurring through Crown corporations, such as Service New Brunswick, and will occur through new government-organized corporations, such as the Energy Solutions Corporation, Mr. Speaker, which no one seems to have any idea of what it is to do, and will occur through numbered corporations, Mr. Speaker, like 698202 NB Incorporated, which did the drug deal with the cannabis companies. Mr. Speaker, government finances are even hidden beyond the reach of the legislature entirely. While it's hard enough sometimes to find out what Crown corporations are doing with their funds, when it comes to private companies managing public services, that information is out of our reach, it seems. The management of public pensions and their investments has been privatized. The management of our ambulance service is private. The management of our extramural hospital program is about to be privatized. The food and cleaning services in our hospitals is about to be privatized. Tax assessments are soon to be taken out of government, and the provision of nursing homes has been privatized. It seems to be a case, Mr. Speaker, of paying more but knowing less. If we don't have the right to know what's happening with public finances, Mr. Speaker, we don't have responsible government. Medavie Health Services subsidiary MBEMS, which manages Ambulance New Brunswick and soon will take over our extramural hospital, refused to provide the Standing Committee on Crown Corporations with their financial statements. Nor did they provide them to the board of Ambulance New Brunswick, Mr. Speaker. It's incredible. We're talking about, over the last 10 years, $1 billion that was transferred to NBEMS, the subsidiary of Medavie Health Service, Mr. Speaker, which in fact is based in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Check it out. It's on their website. To run our ambulances, and yet we're unable to see their financial statements. Mr. Speaker, at the government's public info sessions around the province concerning the privatization of the management of our extramural hospital, no compelling explanation has been given as to why the benefits of integrating our extramural hospital, the 811 service, and Ambulance New Brunswick should be achieved under the management of Medavie Health Services rather than under our own regional health authorities, Mr. Speaker. Furthermore, doing this may in fact violate one of the principles of the Canadian Health Act, which under public administration says all administration of provincial health insurance must be carried out by a public authority. And Mr. Speaker, this alone would cause me to not support the speech from the throne. Mr. Speaker, the secrecy around public money flowing to private interests doesn't stop there. I saw copies of the unredacted contracts for the private public nursing homes, which the Right to Information Commissioner recommended the Department of Social Development provide me following an extensive investigation. However, the Department rejected that recommendation after seeking private legal advice from Stuart McKelvey and is using that to deny public access, Mr. Speaker. Imagine spending public money on lawyers to shut down the right to public information. The secrecy surrounding this government that is invoked over and over and over, Mr. Speaker, is astounding. Both the Public Accounts Committee's questions and my right to information request for the details on the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure's lease with Irving Oil's property company for the new New Brunswick Visitor Welcome Centre in St. Stephen near the Canada-U.S. border were rejected. The rent is secret. The square footage of what we rented is secret. The terms of the lease are secret, and the conditions for terminating the lease are secret, Mr. Speaker. Now, the Right to Information Commissioner is investigating this as well on my behalf, Mr. Speaker. But if they find in my favor, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure also hire a private law firm using public money to find a reason to reject releasing that information to the public? Nous ne savons même pas ce que cette administration recherche dans des négociations avec l'administration fédérale pour obtenir des fonds pour des logements abordables, pour aider les Néo-Brunswickois à réduire leurs coûts énergétiques ou pour augmenter notre utilisation des ressources renouvelables, de chaleur, de combustible et d'énergie. C'est un autre secret. What's not a secret, Mr. Speaker, is the amount of money a single person with long-term needs receives from social assistance each month, $575. That's not enough to live on by any stretch of the imagination. I've had constituents point this out to social development, and the response was, you know what, you have to give up something to get something. Like what, Mr. Speaker? Winter clothing from the second-hand clothing store? How about adequate food, safe, clean housing, or transportation? Certainly giving up one's dignity seems to be on the table. And definitely, if you have a small disability pension, you lose it, Mr. Speaker. You lose it. Mr. Speaker, this is a disgrace. There's nothing in this throne speech which indicates there's any relief whatsoever for those living in poverty, on income assistance, who cannot attach to the workforce, Mr. Speaker. I hear the other side say the best social program is a job, Mr. Speaker, and that, in my view, is such a cynical position when so many people on income assistance cannot attach to the workforce. Many on long-term needs or disability, Mr. Speaker, and they are forced to live on money that is insufficient for living. So why did this throne speech not, for example, index income assistance rates to some measure that would ensure people could actually afford to meet their basic needs, and to change the rules that keep the Department of Social Development from clawing back income or activities that would help the money they do receive go further, like, Mr. Speaker, sharing an apartment. It's a normal thing for people to try and share an apartment to make the limited amount of money they earn go further. But if you're on income assistance and you're a single person and you don't meet any of the exemptions, Mr. Speaker, it's not permitted. Or the many clawbacks, Mr. Speaker, like the small disability pension I mentioned. Can you imagine someone who's on long-term needs, receiving social assistance, and they receive a small disability pension from the federal government under the Canadian pension system of $200, and it's taken away, Mr. Speaker. The throne speech is failing people living in poverty. It says it's investing in initiatives to reduce poverty, but I don't see them, Mr. Speaker. Just saying so doesn't make it so. The multi-billion dollar national housing strategy is to be released by the federal government in a few weeks as part of their national poverty reduction plan. Why is there no mention in the throne speech of what this government intends to do with our share of this money, Mr. Speaker? Again, it's secret. My constituents tell me about the excruciatingly long wait times to access emergency care, to receive an MRI, to see a neurologist, to receive mental health care. and to find a health care provider, Mr. Speaker, all the while their health deteriorates. There's many things this government can do, Mr. Speaker, and the throne speech indicates very little. For example, Mr. Speaker, changing the legislation to enable nurse practitioners to set up private practices who could, in a very short period of time, provide primary health care services to a large number of people waiting on those waiting lists, Mr. Speaker, but the throne speech does not indicate that's something that's going to be done. Tout comme le budget de l'aide sociale a besoin d'être augmenté, le budget des soins de santé doit être renforcé pour mettre fin aux temps d'attente qui sont dangereusement longues. Pourtant, je ne vois rien dans le discours de Trump qui répond à ce problème. So, Mr. Speaker, how do we see increases in the budget? Well, it's about making choices, as we hear all the time, Mr. Speaker. For example, stop giving millions of dollars away to wealthy corporations like the TD Bank. On May 24th, this government announced it was going to provide a forgivable loan. A forgivable loan, Mr. Speaker, in the amount of $6.8 million to a bank. Frank's Bank, in fact, a bank with $1 trillion in assets that made $2.8 billion in profits in its third quarter. There are no words to describe the iniquity of subsidizing a bank. Yet New Brunswickers wait and wait as their health deteriorates for health care services. Mr. Speaker, there is an increasing sense among young New Brunswickers that our province is falling apart. Now, I don't believe that, but it's a perception that some young New Brunswickers are developing. And I understand sometimes why they feel this way. It's just that we don't seem to be facing the problems that we do have head on. The longer those problems get unaddressed, the longer the chances that they will ever be resolved increases. So, Mr. Speaker, par ailleurs, la perte des personnes âgées de 15 à 65 ans dans notre main-d'œuvre s'est accélérée depuis 2011. Environ 26 000 personnes, 5% de la population, ont quitté notre main-d'œuvre durant 6 années. Nous ne savons pas combien de ceux-ci se sont retirés du marché du travail et combien ont quitté le Nouveau-Brunswick pour trouver de meilleurs salaires ou pour travailler dans un domaine de leur choix. But, Mr. Speaker, we know for sure that it hasn't helped that young New Brunswickers have lost $10.5 million in education and tuition tax credits, $22.4 million in tuition rebates, or $2 million in changes to the timely completion benefit. Mr. Speaker, I see nothing in this throne speech to help the majority of students who carry heavy debt, who are going to go elsewhere to try and find work that pays a wage sufficient enough to help them pay down those heavy debts. And, Mr. Speaker, as that student debt grows, banks make money from the accumulating interest. Extraordinary. We should not be forcing our young people to pay interest on the money they need to get an education. And in fact, in addition to that, Mr. Speaker, Canadians pay through the federal government, the banks that administer the Canadian Student Loan Program, $100 million a year, rather than government administrating itself. Mr. Speaker, student loans should be interest-free, and that's something that should have been in the throne speech. On the other end of the generational spectrum, there seems to be absolutely no sense of urgency to meet the needs of the rapidly growing population of older people in our province. Mr. Speaker, the much trumpeted Home First strategy to help people stay in their own homes has really yet to materialize. There is a dire shortage of personal care workers in the province. Why? Because they are paid such low wages. And they've got to bear the cost of transportation between their clients, a time at which they receive no pay as they move from client to client on top of that. Mr. Speaker, so far the Seniors' Health, Well-being and Home Safety Review is the only tangible initiative under Home First that I can see, yet I really don't see how it's going to help seniors remain independent longer. It appears primarily that it's designed to gather data to design the Seniors Navigator program and to provide seniors with brochures that otherwise they could easily pick up. And Mr. Speaker, at this rate, it seems that the Seniors Navigator program will not be in place until at least 2020. And, Mr. Speaker, going through this interview process is the only way for seniors to access the financial assistance to seniors for minor in-home repairs, which seems unfair. Oddly enough, Mr. Speaker, given the thin attention that the throne speech pays to the needs of older people in our society, Mr. Speaker, despite the rising number of people with dementia and need of care for the dementia, Mr. Speaker, there was no mention at all of the promised dementia strategy. It had been promised before, no mention of it. Makes me very concerned that we're not going to see it in the near future. I hope that's not true. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to see the emphasis in the throne speech on supporting those with addictions and mental illness. Mr. Speaker, I've pushed for a greater focus on addictions and mental illness by this government since being elected over 3 years ago, and I'm glad to see that the throne speech is giving some emphasis to the need to address these important issues. Cela dit, je vais attendre d'avoir les détails pour déterminer si ce qui résulte du discours se transforme en des mesures réelles pour améliorer les soins de santé mentale et traiter des troubles addictifs comme le syndrome de dépendance à l'alcool. Mr. Speaker, this province does have an alcohol problem, and unfortunately, government has not yet to admit that, and I am concerned that with the dispersion of so many staff from the Office of the Medical Officer of Health with the necessary expertise to design a harm reduction strategy to reduce alcohol abuse in this province, that will not happen. I'm glad to see the government, though, is following through on the recommendations of our Select Committee on Climate Change to introduce climate change legislation. As we recommended, it's essential that the bill enshrines the carbon pollution reduction targets already adopted by this government in its strategy to move New Brunswick towards a low-carbon economy. Our committee also recommended that this bill require the implications for carbon pollution and adaptation activities be considered for all government-funded and government-approved projects. So we'll have to wait to see the bill, Mr. Speaker, but certainly if the government stays true to the recommendations of the committee, those should be within the bill. Mr. Speaker, as some have said, we are not on the path to meeting our targets whatsoever. The conditions that got us to meet our 2020 target a couple of years early, Mr. Speaker, are not repeatable. There are many more things we're going to have to do. We need ambitious policies, changes in technologies, and changes in the consumption patterns of individuals and firms to achieve those targets, Mr. Speaker, and we need the appropriate mix of policy, regulations, and fiscal measures to do so. I will say, Mr. Speaker, though, it is disappointing that this throne speech does not commit to mandate NB Power, to require NB Power to displace fossil fuel generation on the grid with renewable power generation, a recommendation that was made by our Select Committee and rejected by government, or to adopt more ambitious targets for renewable power sales, or even expand the small-scale community renewable energy program. All recommendations of our committee, Mr. Speaker, which the government rejected. Speaking of the small-scale community renewable energy program, which the throne speech did not mention, it has yet to generate a single kilowatt-hour of renewable power, Mr. Speaker. So it's disconcerting that there is no mention of renewable energy in that sense in the throne speech. Nor is there any mention about encouraging the adoption of renewable energy for heating in buildings, Mr. Speaker, or for transportation or for industrial applications. You know, Mr. Speaker, there was a report recently released that demonstrated how renewable energy could form the basis of real economic growth in this province, Mr. Speaker, that would generate tremendous numbers of jobs and tax revenue to the province and increases in our GDP, but that doesn't seem to be recognized in the throne speech by this government. We know that Ottawa has been working with the provinces to announce measures later this fall for retrofitting buildings and homes. The effort will include investments in modern heating and cooling systems for aging office buildings and factories. Fantastic. For the installation of new windows. Fantastic. For the insulation and lighting and spending on renewable energy systems to reduce the use of electricity, oil, and natural gas. Just as I was saying, Mr. Speaker, fantastic. But, Mr. Speaker, there's nothing in the throne speech to suggest what New Brunswick is going to do as its part in the federal-provincial agreement that will soon be announced to implement this. New Brunswick's future prosperity, in part, depends on making the transition to a green economy fueled by renewable energy. Why this is not a central theme in the throne speech is beyond me. It certainly is central to the green vision for the future of our province. Pourquoi le gouvernement ne dit pas ce qu'il va faire pour aider les ménages et les entreprises à réduire leur coût d'énergie tout en réduisant leur empreinte carbone? It's clearly a strange thing, Mr. Speaker, that it's not in the throne speech. When you think that energy efficiency can be an engine of growth for the New Brunswick economy, creating jobs, encouraging startups, accelerating those startups, and leaving more disposable income in the pockets of New Brunswickers. Mr. Speaker, if you're paying a lot less for heating, whether you're a business or an individual, then you're going to have money for other things, for other priorities in your household or in your business, Mr. Speaker. The Department of it used to be called the Department of Energy, I guess, commissioned an actual study, Mr. Speaker, that looked at the job creation potential, that looked at the economic growth potential, the impacts on GDP by pursuing energy efficiency seriously in this province, Mr. Speaker, as an economic sector. In fact, it was entitled Energy Efficiency, an Engine of Economic Growth through New Brunswick, but it has failed to embrace, this government has failed to embrace that. With respect to putting a price on carbon pollution, Mr. Speaker, the primary way that this will reduce carbon pollution in the short term is if the revenues are recycled back to households, businesses, and municipalities through financing mechanisms and incentives to reduce fossil fuel demand in transportation, as well as in home heating and industrial applications. Mr. Speaker, and this revenue would of course complement whatever the province has negotiated with Ottawa for the same purposes, Mr. Speaker, which so far remains a secret. The throne speech says the revenue, though, from pricing carbon will go into a climate fund with dedicated investments to combat the effects of climate change, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if that's what the funds are being used for, Mr. Speaker, this will not cut the cost of transportation, it will not cut the cost of heating, and it will not cut carbon pollution. For carbon pricing, Mr. Speaker, to be effective, the money has to go back into the hands of those who are paying the carbon price, specifically to assist them in reducing their carbon pollution, Mr. Speaker, in reducing their costs of heating, and reducing their costs of energy, Mr. Speaker, and reducing their costs of transportation, Mr. Speaker, and reducing their carbon footprints. Otherwise, in the short term, it will have no effect. Think about a retired person living in their family home, heating with oil. A carbon price on their oil bill by itself is not going to have any effect except to cause them grief. However, if the revenue is used to ensure that that person can insulate their home, to cut their heating bills, and to replace their oil furnace with an efficient heat pump, Mr. Speaker, then it's mission accomplished. They save money on their energy costs overall. So their costs go down, not up. Let me say that again. Their costs go down, not up, Mr. Speaker. Their house is more comfortable. Their house has a higher resale value, Mr. Speaker, and their carbon footprint is reduced, Mr. Speaker. La même chose peut se dire pour tous les propriétaires de voitures. L'impact d'un prix sur le carbone disparaît vite quand le prix de l'essence suit un mouvement de montagne russe. Par contre, les revenus pourraient être retournés à les municipalités pour améliorer la fréquence de transport en commun ou le rendre plus fréquent. Un parti pourrait aussi aider les gens à s'acheter une voiture électrique quand vient le temps de remplacer leur véhicule. Les déplacements coûteraient moins cher et la pollution par le carbone serait réduite. Mission accomplie. Mr. Speaker, for carbon pricing to reduce carbon pollution, it does mean recycling the revenue into measures that will help households and businesses to cut their carbon pollution. Minimal carbon pollution, minimal costs, Mr. Speaker. That's what the critics of carbon pricing don't understand. Reduce your carbon pollution, you reduce your costs, Mr. Speaker, and you reduce your contribution to our rapidly deteriorating climate, Mr. Speaker. However, Mr. Speaker, diverting that money to roads and bridge upgrades, to relocating infrastructure, to installing bigger culverts will mean in the short term the price on carbon will be naught if it's not recycled to the people who are paying it. While the throne speech makes a nod to supporting regional economic development, Mr. Speaker, there are no details in the throne speech, Mr. Speaker, and that's disconcerting because we know, Mr. Speaker, there isn't simply one economy in New Brunswick. Our economy is made up of a lot of local and regional economies, Mr. Speaker, and there has been a lack of focus on supporting the initiatives of our local, of our regions and local communities to pursue economic development in their areas, Mr. Speaker. When you think about particularly those areas of the province that have lost most or all of their industry, to make that transition from a workforce almost entirely dependent on a few large industries to one where those don't exist, that kind of support has not been forthcoming, but it's never too late, Mr. Speaker. So there needs to be details, and soon, about what this looks like, and it can't be just a cursory effort. Mr. Speaker, in this context, New Brunswick has been without a rural development strategy for a long time. People in rural New Brunswick feel quite abandoned. There's not enough time to talk about what should go into a rural development strategy, but certainly, Mr. Speaker, this government can start by standing with our woodlot owners. The economic injustice done by government after government, since Frank McKenna eliminated the woodlands of private woodlot owners as the primary source of supply to the mills, is unconscionable. At a recent Public Accounts Committee meeting, the Assistant Deputy Minister of Energy and Resource Development said they still haven't decided whether to enforce the proportionality provision of the Crown Lands and Forests Act, which is designed to provide some kind of fair access to the wood market for woodlot owners. And it hasn't been enforced, according to the Auditor General, since 2002. And she said, enforce it or get rid of it. And the Assistant Deputy Minister said they haven't decided yet what to do. Meanwhile, Mr. Speaker, the woodlot owners of this province continue to face economic injustice. Mr. Speaker, New Brunswickers are sick and tired, in fact, of feeling that their governments cave to the interests of a handful of wealthy corporations rather than knowing that their government has their back and is always acting in their interest. This seems to be on display right now, Mr. Speaker, with regards to the spraying of glyphosate. Despite the widespread opposition to its use on our forests and under our power lines, despite the mounting evidence of its ecological impacts and its health hazards, the former government cut a forestry deal that increased the amount of spraying, and this government refuses to act, continuing to issue permits to enable the spraying of glyphosate on our forests, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is much to be done in New Brunswick, and this throne speech just doesn't rise to those challenges. It sort of represents the ongoing approach of the government, which is, when you look at it in totality, it's kind of a hodgepodge of strategies, kind of a crazy quilt of programs and initiatives, Mr. Speaker, that don't fall within a coherent vision for where New Brunswick needs to go, Mr. Speaker, for the future of New Brunswick. It doesn't do enough to build on what's great about New Brunswick. It doesn't do enough to ensure that what we rely on and utilize and harness what's great about New Brunswick to address the problems and issues that we have in New Brunswick. Mr. Speaker, in fact, New Brunswickers are getting pretty tired of the two old parties playing ping-pong with the reins of power, playing politics, Mr. Speaker, putting politics and political considerations in front of the public interest. At next year's election, Mr. Speaker, New Brunswickers have an opportunity to do something that hasn't been done in 100 years. In fact, it will be the 100th anniversary of the last minority government in New Brunswick within a year or two, when the Farmers' Party, Mr. Speaker, the Farmers' Party, the United Farmers' Party, rose up and said they were not being well served by the old original two parties, Mr. Speaker, and they were elected in sufficient numbers to bring them out of minority government to address the issues that were so important to people of the province at the time in rural New Brunswick that needed to be addressed, and that's what happened, Mr. Speaker, as a result of that election. So New Brunswickers have an opportunity to return a minority government at the next election with Greens holding the balance of power, so in fact that the public's interest will triumph over political consideration in the next government in this legislative assembly, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.